of his head. It was like they were making some kind of mental connection. And so this was an a drawing that Charlie did after one of his hypnotic recession sessions. Other things that came out from Jack and Charlie was what their hands looked like. They described their hands as having 4 fingers, but there was a they could fold them. There was a fold right here, so they could fold this thing across so they could have opposing fingers. Jack remembered that. So did Charlie. My impression of their faces was that they were wearing some kind of mask. That seemed to be what I thought. Charlie also had a memory of standing at some kind of window-like portal, looking down at the canoe that was still out in the middle of the lake, and the campfire off in the distance over here. He seemed to remember that. These are all independent of one another now. This was another illustration that Jack did. I'm going to try to move along a little faster because you're all falling asleep on me here. There's another rendering that Jack did of what these things look like. And then another one from the front. And to me, it seemed like they had a mask on it. And this is another drawing that Jack did of the hand holding one of these rod things. Another one of the hand. This is another one of Jack. He remembered being under this same panel-like thing, and he remembered a lot more than I did. He remembered being under this some kind of sonic device that ran these waves of something down onto him. It's another illustration that he did. These were all done on a computer, I believe. And they also had him on a table that it was almost like a cymatic vibrating table of some sort that ran these pulses through his body. This was the device that he remembered them taking the sperm samples with the fingers. You can see how the fingers wrap around it from the sides. Now, I had a different memory of this device. The memory I have is more of like a bottle shape. So our memories don't match exactly, but this was another rendering that Jack did. And he also remembered them wearing some kind of belt with a buckle on it, right here. Now here's this is fairly accurate too. One of the things that came out after Ray started the investigation was he asked us if we had any kind of scars on our body. And a few years before, Jack had it looked like a tumor or something that was growing on one of his shins. So he went to the local hospital and they removed it, and they said that they were going to send it to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta for a biopsy. And a couple of months went by, and the doctor called and said, well, I'm just letting you know that the biopsy came back and it's not cancer. Well, we really don't know what it is, but don't worry about it. So when Ray asked Jack if he had any kind of surgeries recently, Jack said, well, yeah, I had this lump removed from my leg a while ago. And Ray said, oh, well, can you send me the medical report? So Jack said, yeah, okay. And he went down to the hospital where they did the surgery, and he asked for the report, and the woman at the records office said, oh, you were in the military. And my brother said, no, I was never in the military. She goes, oh, yes, you were. And he goes, no, I was not. And she said, well, you had to be. And he said, what are you talking about? She goes, well, this is a medical report. It turned out that the sample didn't go to the CDC. It went to an Air Force base in Michigan. And the report was signed by an Air Force major. I can't remember his name. They did the biopsy, and they concluded that the tissue was the type of tissue that grows over a wound caused by a needle. So, like if they go into your, they'll go into your shin to remove bone marrow, and the needle irritates the surface of the bone, so the body creates this lumpy tissue-like thing to protect the wound. And that's what this report said. Well, one of my brother's friends in Vermont works for the state. He works for the state medical, one of the medical departments up there, and he worked with cancer patients for years. And so Jack asked him if it was common for tissue samples to be sent to an Air Force base in Michigan, and he said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've never heard of that before." So how it wound up there, we don't know. And in fact, the records person at the hospital wouldn't give him the report. She said, "No, I can't give you this report." And he said, "Why?" She said, "Because I can't." So Jack got back to Ray, and I don't know how Ray managed to do it. He managed to get the report, and that's when we found out that it had come from this Air Force base in Michigan. And I can't recall, and I don't have a copy of it. I'd be happy to read it to you. Post-Allagash events. This is 1993. Chuck was up visiting Jack and Mary for a weekend, and they had these sliding doors that looked out onto their property. And Chuck woke up one night and saw this light coming in through the doors. The moon was actually on the side of the house, and he couldn't figure out, over here was where the moon was, and there was this other light right here outside the house. He couldn't figure out what was going on, and then the next thing he realized, these guys were outside. And when he saw them, they literally started coming through the window, and this is what Charlie did. He took his covers and pulled them over his head. Charlie never does that sort of thing. So there were a few other events. In fact, that same night, the next day, when they got up, Charlie said, "My God, I had this weird dream last night that these things were outside, and these aliens were coming in the house." And Jack's had the same dream. He said that he woke up at night and they were in the bedroom, and he took his covers, pulled them over his head. His wife remembered seeing deer around the bed, with big eyes. That was her memory of a deer. So they've had a few other events at the same location over the years. Then in 1995, I was still living in the same house in Brooklyn. I lived there for 27 years. And the house next door to us looked like this. It was completely covered in ivy. We had, between the two houses, there was a driveway. And my wife and I were living on the downstairs apartment on the house across the driveway. And Charlie was living upstairs, and his bedroom was directly above ours, in fact. And one night, my wife Carol and I went to sleep, and I woke up at exactly 3:32 a.m. And opposite the foot of our bed, we had a window with shades. We didn't have curtains, we had shades. And I could see this blue light coming in around the edge of the shade. And it was a blue like a police light, that kind of blue. And it would blink off, and then it would come back on again a second later and get brighter and brighter and brighter for like 2 or 3 seconds, and then it would blink off again. And it kept repeating this cycle, going off, coming on, getting brighter, going off. And my first thought was, oh my God, there's a police car in the driveway. What the heck is going on? Maybe it's a problem. But I couldn't move. I could not move. In fact, my eyelids felt like they weighed, 10 pounds. I had to fight to keep my eyelids open to see what the heck was going on with this thing? Well, that was all I remember. The next morning, I woke up, and as soon as I woke up, I had this, just for a second, I had a flash memory that there was somebody in the room that night. And I was like, oh man, what is, I wonder who was running around our yard. So I go out of the back of the house to have a cigarette. I was smoking then. And on this house, I saw this.
Whoa.
Now, I don't know how familiar you are with ivy. And these houses are covered in stucco. So it's a very rough surface, almost like granular cement. And when ivy attaches to that stuff, you cannot get it off. The ivy was completely off of this spot, as if it had been sandblasted. There were no tendrils. Usually when you pull it off of something, it leaves these little tendrils and things. This was completely gone. And I took this picture about a month later. So it was even sharper around the edges when we first saw it. It took me about a month to actually take a photograph of it. And I lived in this house for 27 years, and I never, ever have seen that. When I show people other people this picture, they can't figure it out either. And I actually went to the people next door. There were some women students who were living downstairs in the apartment in this house, in that house. And I went to their front door and I rang the doorbell, and they knew who I was. They knew we were neighbors. And I said, "Hey, what'd you guys do to your house?" And they were like, "What are you talking about, Jim?" And I said, "Well, did you?" And they said, "What?" So I took them outside and I showed them that, and they were like, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, okay, well, we'll see you. Bye." And they turned around and walked back in the house like nothing happened. They didn't even want to acknowledge it. And I thought, wow, this is really bizarre. Well, a few years later, we were down in New York with Bud Hopkins. There was a film company doing a documentary on Bud, and he asked Charlie and I if we would participate. If they could film us being hypnotized and regress over what could possibly have happened with this incident. So both of us went under regression, which was filmed. They told me that when I was under, all that was touching the bed was the back of my head and my heels. The rest of me was arced up. They thought I was going to slide right off the bed. This is a illustration that Charlie did of the house. So my wife's and I bedroom window was here. Charlie's his bedroom was right up here. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is Jim's memory. When I was standing outside looking at this, when I first saw it, the phone rang inside. So I go in, and it's Charlie. And he's like, "Oh, Jim, I had an abduction dream last night, and the weirdest thing was so scary, it seemed so real." And I said, "Why don't you come outside? I want to show you something." When I brought him outside and he saw that, I thought he was going to faint. It was like he was in total shock. So anyway, to get back to Bud, they put us under hypnosis and regressed us. This is a composite facsimile that Charlie did of two pictures. The first one of the original house, and then the second one of mine, so you could get a little better perspective on what it kind of looked like from a different perspective. And it appears from the hypnotic regressions that both Charlie and I were abducted again. And in fact, they did two hypnotic regressions on me. The first one that we did, which was filmed, I remembered getting up. I was able to get up out of bed, and I went to the window, and I looked out the window, and Bud said, "Well, do you see anything out there?" And I said, "Oh, it's a cop car. There's a cop car out in the driveway, and it's the lights going on the roof." And he's like, "Oh, well, what kind of cop car is it?" And I said, "Well, it looks like a regular car. I mean, the wheels are right there. I see the wheels right there." And he's like, "Oh, really? You see the wheels right there, Jim? How high is your window off the driveway?" Which was, probably 6-8 feet. And I'm like, "Well, yeah, the wheels. I'm looking right at them. I can see them." And he's like, "Jim, how can you be seeing wheels that are even with your window?" And then all of a sudden I remember this thing changing. It became rounder. And it had the weirdest thing on the outside surface. It was like it was covered with a million little prisms that kept changing colors. Like they would, at one point, one would be orange, another one would be bluish, another one would be greenish, and it moved. It was constantly changing around the side of this thing. And then I remembered two of these beings in the bedroom. And I ran, we had some big speakers in the bedroom, and my first impulse was to run and hide behind one. That's what I figured I could hide from. And then they kept coming for me, and then I ran past them out of the room, out of the bedroom, and out into the driveway, the back of the house. This was a parking area right here. So I came out back door and went down these stairs, and I was standing out here, and the two of these beings were standing next to me, and I was looking at this craft. It wasn't that big. I mean, it could fit the total space between those two houses was maybe 16 feet, somewhere around there, not even that. I remember standing there looking at it, and all of a sudden, I was terrified at this point. And then all of a sudden, I felt like, wow, these guys are my friends. I even remember saying to Bud, I'm not afraid of them anymore. I'm not afraid of them. These guys are good guys. And so they brought me out, because I was starting to get agitated again. And so later I said to Bud, something what didn't feel right about that, It was almost as if somebody flicked a switch, and then all of a sudden I felt friendly. I said, I want to go back. I want you to take me back, and let's go further on this. So they did. They put me back under, and we got out to this point, and then I remembered, I don't remember going into the ship. I remember approaching it, and it had this thrumming feeling. I could feel in my chest. It was like a vroom, 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 vroom. And then the next thing I remember was being in a room with some chairs, and there was one of these creatures sitting next to me, and there were two behind me. And either I was looking at a projection that was like a rounded, almost like a portal. It was large, it was big. It had to be at least 6-8 feet in diameter. So either it was some kind of projection or I was looking out. And I was dumbfounded because I was looking, it was like I was looking out into space, but it wasn't dark. It wasn't black like with little white pinpricks of stars. It was really, really bright, almost white, with these kind of pinkish colors in it. And I remember seeing like a washed out green. And then I remembered it's the only time I've ever had a clear message in my head. And it said, there are more universes than you can imagine, or there are more universes than you think. I can't remember which one of those it was. Look and see. And that was it. That's all I remember. I didn't remember anything else after that. Charlie seemed to remember being put through another examination, but the room he was in, he was asked, what are the dimensions of the room? He said, it was about 16 feet long by 8 feet wide. And when they asked me what the dimensions of the room I was in, I said, it was about 16 feet long by 8 feet wide. So that's what came out of that regression. So this was 1995, and I think Bud did the regression around 2005, somewhere around there. So the next thing I want to talk about, and I'll go through this fairly quickly, is what happened to my brother's and mine and Charlie's artwork. And I'll also mention Chuck Rack. Charlie Fultz, before the Allagash, did this kind of artwork. Pretty classic stuff. Excellent watercolors. And immediately coming back, he dropped that and decided he wanted to do medical artwork, which he then proceeded to do for many, many years afterwards. So that was a little strange because it was immediate. When I came back, my artwork went from this, which was what I was making initially at the program in artisanry. This is pre-Allagash, to this stuff.
Wow.
And I started making this immediately upon coming back from the Allagash. When we were still up there, in fact, the very next day, I remember sitting at the campsite, and a flock of geese, it was late August, so the geese were starting to go south. And, you know, geese flying is kind of V formation, you know. I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania, in the countryside. I'm surrounded by farmland. And, you know, so geese are geese and, you know, ducks are ducks, and they do what they do because that's what they are. I never really thought about it. And I remember sitting on at the edge of the lake looking at these things, and then all of a sudden I knew why they fly like that. And it's because the lead bird, when they flap their wings, they create a pressure wave. It's almost like a little rotating vortex that all the other ducks then use to conserve energy. And that's why it's a V, almost like a bow wave from a ship. So the first duck does this with his wings, and it creates this little eddy. And then all the other birds ride on that eddy. And if you watch them long enough, you'll see at some point the lead bird will drop away and another bird will take its place. And so they use that technique to conserve energy while they fly. And it just came into my head from out of nowhere. A few days later, we were at another campsite, and I was sitting there kind of staring at the trees, and all of a sudden I knew how the process of bark creation works. It just came into my head. And the way that works is, you know, when a tree grows, it expands, the rings, you know, grows and it gets bigger, and it stresses the surface tissue of the tree. And so eventually it breaks up, and depending on what kind of tree it is, you get these, you know, signature patterns of tree bark. That's how that works. That came out of nowhere. A few days after that, while we were still on the Allagash, we were at a place called Round Pond, and we were moving from one campsite to the other side of the pond because of the wind. And all of a sudden, I had this intense. It wasn't a vision, but it was an understanding that the trees, the way the trees were moving, the way the water was rippling on the surface of the lake, the way the air felt, that every one of these things was alive and it was sentient. And that I was part of this, that I wasn't separate from this single sentiency. It just popped into my head. And while we were up there, I had this other epiphany about how I could take these processes and apply them to my artistic media. And so when I came back from Boston, all this stuff started to come out of me. I was almost thrown out of program in artisanry because they wanted me to make plates and pictures. Instead, I started making this stuff, and luckily I was able to convince them that I could pull it off. The program that I was in had 10 students at the graduate level, and after 3 years, only myself and one other student got our degree. Now, Jack's gets really bizarre. This is his pre-Allagash work. He did, impressionist landscapes and poster art. This is a silkscreen poster of a California garter snake, which actually won director or a design prize in Boston in '77. This is also in the Smithsonian National Gallery Corcoran Museum collection in Washington, D.C. Jack was the youngest American artist ever to have his work accepted into the permanent collection in Washington. Well, when he came back, he immediately started to make this stuff. I had no idea what it was or why he was doing it, but he was absolutely obsessed, as I was, with my work. And this is some of the work that he did right after coming back from the Allagash. He had a studio in the house. Now, this stuff is fairly interesting because I would ask him, like, where's this stuff coming from, Jack? And he said, no idea, but I know I have to do it. I just know I have to do it. I gotta do this. I can't stop. And he became obsessive. I mean, I don't know how, if any of you out here have experienced obsessive compulsive behavior after an abduction, but from many people that I've talked to, it seems to be a common trait. You know, housewives get abducted and then they suddenly think they're making an anti-gravity motor in their basement. You know, I know one guy, very good abductee that was working with, I think it was Bud, who was working as a manager at a Club Med down in the Caribbean somewhere. He threw that away and wanted to become a firewalker. Bizarre. But I see that over and over and over again.
He's pretty
You
advanced.
suddenly have this weird obsession. This is more of Jack's work. Many years later, after he was doing this stuff, this was 76, 77, 78, somebody turned us on to this book in the 90s, Anti-Gravity in the World Grid by David Hatcher Childress. And he said, you know, I think this is what Jack was trying to get at when he was doing his artwork. I don't know if any of you know much about the world grid. I'm not going to get into it because it'll take way too long. But some scientists seem to believe that the Earth has an energy grid in the shape of a icosahedron that surrounds our planet. And in fact, when they analyzed the interstices, or these meeting points of these triangles, a lot of ancient city sites are located right directly on them. Here's another picture of the grid. This is called unified vector angles, which was analyzed by Buckminster Fuller. So you can see, you know, I have absolutely no proof that this is what he was, you know, trying to work out, but boy, it looks really similar to what he was doing. And at that exact same time, I had another obsession going where I became obsessed with ancient temples. You know, Teotihuacan, Tiwanaku, Baalbek, Cheops. I was obsessed with learning as much as I could about them. I didn't know why. I just was, you know, I mean, artists do weird things. So over the years, I've read quite a number of books on this stuff. Earth grids. Henry Lincoln wrote a book called The Holy Place, and David Wood, a book called Genesis, which are about these grid maps that are literally cover all of Europe. Another book I got into with all this stuff was Peter Tompkins' Mysteries of the Mexican Pyramids. I was looking through a magazine one day, and I saw they had a picture. Now this is, you know, 76, right after coming back from the Allagash. And I saw a picture of a computer grid, a computer motherboard. And another one of these flashes came into my head, and I thought, my God, that looks exactly like a city grid. It looks like one of these city grids, you know. And so at that time I was reading this book, and in this book, Tompkins describes this event that happened in 1906 at Teotihuacan in Mexico. This is in the Valley of Mexico. This is Teotihuacan. Temple of the Sun, Temple of the Moon, and there's this long kind of corridor that runs in front of them. And all of this around here at one time was a huge city complex. Well, in 1906, the president of Mexico assigned his brother-in-law, I think it was, to be the official excavator of Teotihuacan. They were gold diggers. They were looking for treasure. And so this guy started digging around up in here, and one of the things that he found right here, which was a substrate of the structure of the floor, was a solid layer of mica that was under the floor. It wasn't decorative, so it means that whatever reason they put that there for, it wasn't to look nice, because it was hidden underneath another floor. And it turns out that the mica type that they used came from Brazil. Now, there's plenty of mica sources around in the mountains in the Valley of Mexico. Why did they bring it 1,000 miles from Brazil? And so that kind of made me think, like, what do they use mica for? Well, mica is a dielectric. They use it in the electrical industry. It's also, I think it's a shield for gamma rays. I'm not sure if that's correct, but I seem to remember reading that. At this site, all these temples here, same thing. They all contain layers of mica, thick layers of mica, some of them almost a foot thick. Why? Why would they be there? Yeah.